For today's adventure, we're in Buffalo, New York, and we're going to talk about a haunting on Englewood Avenue. Let's get started. So go down any street, and I almost guarantee you about 2 out of 3 houses on that street are going to have some kind of reports of paranormal activity. You would fill countless volumes about it. Englewood Avenue here in Buffalo, New York is definitely no different. Now, there are 2 stories I'm going to actually relate here today. One is more of an eerie story. The other one is actually a story that centers around some paranormal activity in a house on Englewood Avenue. So the first story we're going to talk about was related to me earlier, I'd say about a couple of months ago. And it was actually related to me about someone who knew a police officer. Now, the story goes something like this. There was an elderly lady actually, lived in a house on Englewood Avenue. Her mailbox began to get loaded. Newspapers weren't picked up. And so the neighbors, they began to get, of course, concerned. So they actually tried to call the neighbor, those who had her phone number. And there was no responses. Of course, that threw red flags everywhere. So eventually someone who knew her called the police, and they went and they met the police at the house. So they let themselves in the house because that person obviously had a key. It was a family member. And they found, of course, sadly, that the old lady had passed away. So what makes this story, although tragic, kind of eerie? So what the police officers and the EMTs noticed was that every clock in the house, whether it was analog, digital, wristwatches, they all had stopped literally at the same time. I believe the time was about 3:30. So we all know that spirits are made up of energy, anyone who has followed the paranormal. So you have to wonder, when she passed away, was the energy dispersal there that powerful that it was able to stop all the clocks at her time of death? It's actually pretty crazy to think about. Pretty eerie stuff. So now about the actual haunting that takes place on Englewood Avenue. Now, this isn't no different from any other paranormal story you might hear about literally any house. But this particular haunting has been documented. I actually found out about this haunting in this book here, Ghosts of the Northeast by David J. Pitkin. And I was actually very surprised to find this story in this book about our very own Englewood Avenue. So the story in a nutshell is like this. So a family moves into just an average 2-story apartment on Englewood Avenue. Now, I'm going to put out right here that this is still an active apartment. It's a private residence. So I'm not going to say the address, even though I do know where it is. This way, it's just for the privacy of the people that are actually still living there. So they were going, when they first moved in, they run through the place. And they were surprised to actually find a lot of religious artifacts in the basement of the house. There was chalices, there was a vestment, there was everything you could possibly find. There was even a full-size cross in the basement. So it actually turns out that the apartment building, house by the way, was an old Greek Orthodox church. Now, that's all fine and good. Then they got a hold of the vestment and they opened it up. Now, when they opened up the vestment, a cool breeze comes out of the vestment. That is pretty much where the stories of the paranormal begin. So they actually tried to find the pastor who was last in charge of the church, and they actually did find him, but he was retired. So they gave away and donated most of the religious artifacts they found to another church. But that did not stop the paranormal activity. In fact, it ramped up shortly right after that. The first thing they began to notice was dead blackbirds would actually kind of just magically appear up in the attic. There was even one that slammed the window, and when they came across it, it was still stuck to the window with the wings in an outstretched position. That in itself wouldn't be paranormal, but the blackbirds that they would find in the attic dead just definitely raises some questions, and it only upticks from there. It wasn't long after that they started getting cold spots and drafts throughout the building. Then they began to hear something that I'm actually pretty familiar with, knocks on the walls and knocks up from the basement with no source that they could identify. Then they began to hear footsteps up in the attic. Now, at least for the family that lived there, the whole thing actually kind of culminated with not exactly a full body apparition, but they would see like mists and swirls of smoke that would manifest, take humanoid shape, and would just rise up and go through into the attic area. Well, it was only a rental, so by this time that was definitely more than enough for the family, and I believe they have since moved to Albany. Now, the question is, was something stored in that box that they opened up that got released with the cold air? Because cold air was still part of the paranormal activity that has been reported from the place. It's hard to say. I tend to think the place used to be a church. Now, when it got converted into living spaces, you had two conflicting energies. You had the energy of everyday life, people living in there, probably having fights, arguments, and at one point this family did, and their pictures actually got knocked off of the wall, and the way them pictures were hung up, they would have had to got lifted up and knocked down. So I just wonder if it's a clash of the two different energies, the religious energy from when it was a church and a place of worship, and the energies from when the families moved in once the place was converted. Converting the place itself, could that have stirred up the paranormal activity? It's hard to say. I think those, in my opinion, are very good possibilities. Now, again, it's a private residence. That family came and went, and in this book here is literally the only information I have on the haunting. So I really have no way of knowing if the haunting has continued or not. I guess that will be something if someone's living there have found out, but so far there has been no true reports of any more paranormal activity coming from the house. But that case, we'll never know. And with that being said, that's the end of it. Don't forget to hit that subscription bell so you can be notified when new videos drop. And don't forget to smash that like and subscribe button, and we will see you next time.